Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first and only thing I've been thinking about is COVID-19. Coronavirus impacts everything, and I mean everything. We will never return to life as it was prior to the devastation called COVID-19. How can we? Everyone knows someone who was taken by this plague, and we all know families destroyed and people deeply scarred. I receive as many as 9 announcements a day about funerals. Funerals I'm not permitted to attend. Condolence calls I can only make virtually. After the plague passes, whenever it passes, life will not be the same again. Little things will not be the same. For example, I'm a chin stroker. I suppose I started this idiosyncratic gesture and habit when I had a beard. I felt distinguished. It was almost de rigueur for anyone with a beard that wanted to appear thoughtful and sophisticated to stroke his beard and his chin. Beardless now for many years, I still unconsciously stroke my chin periodically. These days, when I catch myself in the act, my hand freezes mid-stroke. I'm in violation of one of the fundamental safety rules of COVID-19. I'm not keeping my hands away from my face. It sounds trivial, but it's not. It's serious stuff. I'm also a handshaker. A handshaker. My father taught me that shaking hands was more than the perfunctory act of saying hello or goodbye. It was an art form. It was a conduit for important messaging. It said a lot about me and even more about the person whose hand I shook. My father taught me to give a proper handshake, not what he called a dead fish. He also taught me how important it was to seize the moment and convert that moment into a positive impression. This critical unspoken message exists no more. Elbow bumps, the COVID-19 heir to the handshake, is at best a poor replacement. There's no nuance, no style, all bump. In the spectacular political novel called Primary Colors, attributed to Joe Klein, he was actually the author, which was really a portrayal of Bill Clinton's rise to power. The author, first named Anonymous, describes 3 distinct handshakes employed by the protagonist in the book. The double-handed handshake, the hand-to-elbow handshake, and of course the all-powerful hand-to-shoulder handshake. Clinton mastered all these art forms. Handshakes have a history. That history is now about to end. We'll all get over it. Don't worry, we'll move on. We will make do, because in the Arab world, Asia, let's say, for instance, also, they don't shake hands very often. But in our world, the Western world, that was different. The handshake has its roots in ancient Rome. A proper handshake was a right hand extended towards and clasping the hand of another. And what would happen is your dagger hand was your right hand, and your dagger was always on your left side in your waistband on the side of your tunic. The dagger hand was that right hand. If you reached your dagger, you had to cross your hand to the left side. When you extended your hand daggerless, it was a gesture of peace and fraternity. Fast forward to World War II, to the Holocaust, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It took place on Passover. The fighters were a ragtag group with no chance of defeating the Germans. Entire countries fell to the Germans overnight, or in just days. These fighters knew that they were rising up against Nazism to protect the principle, not because they expected to emerge victorious. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place on Passover because of the symbol of the Passover Seder and the holiday of Passover, which was that of freedom. Some of their weapons were the real thing, but many were just makeshift. When the young, idealistic fighters took their weapons, they shook hands with their commanders, and they said l'chaim, which means to life. And then they said l'mavet, which means to death. They shook hands, and then, while being fully aware of what awaited them, they declared to life and to death. COVID-19 is killing many of us, literally. Our goal is to come out alive. And if, in order to do that, we must change certain of our behaviors and alter some of our norms, so be it. From now on, when I wave to someone in the distance after this is all over, and I'm going to be showing them more respect and caring than if I stood face to face with them, bumped their hands or shook their hand. And although they can't see behind my mask, I'm giving them a great big smile. For confirmation, look at my eyes. Look for the twinkle. I've also been thinking about oil, about the coronavirus and oil. Oil prices have been affected by corona. One of the most positive and unforeseen consequences of COVID-19 is a massive drop in oil prices across the global market. A drop that, much like coronavirus, reverberates around the world. Oil prices began to fall before we knew about COVID-19. OPEC's inability to rein in Saudi Arabia, an OPEC member, coupled with their inability to rein in Russia, a friend of OPEC but not a member, helps explain the continued downward trend. During the most recent OPEC meeting held in March, there was a failed attempt to lower output in order to drive up prices, but no agreement was reached. When the deadline for capped oil output by members expired, the Saudis and the Russians independently flooded the oil market, a move that would further drive down the price of oil. Is it possible that they colluded, deciding to make the move together and keep it a secret of all of it? Of course it is a possibility. But that is something we'll never know unless, of course, they tell us. They took a critical step. When the price of oil goes down, the biggest suppliers make the biggest profits in the long term. Of course, the smaller ones get driven out of business. Big suppliers often drive out the smaller competition who can't afford to produce. Corona is keeping us at home. It's another reason why prices of oil went down, not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world, including Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. That means fewer people are driving and less gas is being pumped. The demand has dropped tremendously, as has the price of oil. For any of you who filled up your tank recently, you would know that the price has dropped since the beginning of COVID by at least two-thirds. It's a third of the price of what it once was. There's another variable to add to the equation. Russia and Saudi Arabia are respectively the second and third top oil producers in the world. The number one oil producer in the world since 2017 is none other than the United States of America. The U.S. became the largest oil producer in the world because of shale. Shale is oil that is produced from sedimentary rock. And there can be no doubt that the primary motivation for the United States to enter the oil market through the conversion of shale to oil was to drive the price of oil down. Secondary motivation then, and a strong contender for first, was to relocate the center of oil supply from the Middle East. The move served to stabilize a very unstable, price-fluctuating market, one that would rise and fall depending on the mood in the region of the Middle East. The United States controls now 15.5% of the world's market shares for oil sales, while Russia controls only 13% and Saudi Arabia only 12%. Take a moment to digest that information. It is hardly conventional wisdom, but it is essential. Conventional wisdom says that the Saudis and the Gulf states are the major oil producers. And way down the list would be Russia and the United States, and then maybe Venezuela. In reality, however, the model is inverted. The list goes United States, Russia, and then Saudi Arabia. According to experts on the Saudi Arabian and Russian oil production, the drive to flood the global oil market will continue all the way through July. 3 months is equivalent to 1/4 of the annual financial reports. From January of 2020 to April 1st, the first economic quarter of 2020, the price of oil dropped by more than 60%. This is a price war, and the price war is greater for the consumer. The only downside is that most of us are unable to avail ourselves of this bonus in gas prices because most of us remain near home, in home, sheltered down. The price of oil is hovering about $20 a barrel, goes down to $10, and there was one point where it was actually free, or they were paying people to take their oil. That's unbelievable. The break-even point is when it's no longer profitable to produce oil, when it costs more to pull oil out of the ground than the price of the sale of that oil. For most companies, that price hovers about $25 to $35 per barrel. For American companies producing shale, that number begins at $35 per barrel. There are only 2 companies that can produce under $35 per barrel. One would expect production to slow down so that those prices go up. But that's not the case. Russia and Saudi Arabia want to squeeze out the United States out of the market, their main competitor, where the break-even point of shale is much higher than the break-even point for oil coming out of the ground. If Russia and Saudi Arabia have their way, it will slash U.S. oil production. Only 12 oil companies in the United States make that price level at $35. It costs most of them more than that. And that's a big deal. The dramatic low price per barrel is slowly making its way to the pumps. The salient point here is to understand that gasoline, the price of gasoline, will indeed drop. That's good for us in the short term. But Russia and Saudi Arabia are using world events to destroy the United States, their nemesis and big oil competitor. And as a result, they will force the price of oil up again in the long run. These countries are interested in destroying the United States oil competition, not aiding humanity. Coming up next, points of view. First up is an op-ed from Ynet News. Ynet is Yediot Achronot, Yediot's website. It's in Hebrew and in English. Ynet is one of the best places to get information about Israel and the Jewish world. It is an exceptional website. Almost all of the Hebrew edition is translated onto the English site. One of the best parts of the site, of the newspaper, is the opinion section. Yediot has a stable of exceptional thinkers and writers. The column I've selected was written by Ben-Dror Yemini. He has been on JBS numerous times, so you should actually recognize him. Ben-Dror is a thoughtful, critical, nuanced thinker. His two most essential motivational forces in his writing and his thought are justice and the Jewish people. Now, it's important to get a sense of what I'm talking about here. It gives insight into his character. It was published on April 21st, and it's called Anti-Semitism is the World's Oldest Fake News. This is how Ben-Dror begins. In order to perpetrate the most heinous act in human history, it took the Nazis years of brainwashing its public. Over the course of human history, Jews were always demonized, sometimes for a few years and sometimes for a few millenniums. After all, anti-Semitism is the world's oldest fake news. Not every brainwashing ends with a genocide, but every genocide starts with brainwashing. When talking about blunt anti-Semitism that turns murderous, the cases are few. After all, the Jews living in the West are not only suffering from anti-Semitism, they also prosper over there. It's not only a matter of delusional intellectuals in the United Nations. There is an automatic majority of ignorant states. And while we have grown accustomed, we shouldn't. Yemini then goes on to explain how the United Nations and the World Health Organization, as well as politicians, perpetuate the anti-Semitism. He writes, the World Health Organization, the WHO, for example, is a professional, non-political organization. A little less than a year ago, the WHO's annual meeting convened in Geneva. On the WHO's table were placed a myriad of world issues, like the millions of people in Venezuela who contracted malaria, or the millions in Syria who lost access to medical services, or tens of millions in Yemen who are on the precipice of dying from hunger. This is only a partial list of the issues that were supposed to keep the convention busy. So, was any decision made regarding the tens of millions of people suffering from man-made atrocities? No. Only one condemnation against Israel due to health conditions in the occupied territories. Ben-Dror Yemini now looks at the United Nations. He writes, the same happens dozens of times a year at the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Human Rights Council. 9 out of 10 condemnations issued by these bodies are directed at Israel, with countries like Germany, France, and Belgium taking the side of states like Iran and Sudan. Yemini raises the obvious example of the British Labour Party. He writes, one such example is Claire Short, a former member of the British Labour Party who once blamed Israel for the majority of violence around the world. While it is safe to assume 99% of the victims around the world wouldn't be able to point out Israel on the map, why not feed the hatred? Ben-Dror has a wonderful insight. Listen to what he has to say. Once it was the ignorant who hated the Jews. Now it's the liberal, enlightened, and educated who hate the Jewish state. He shows how warped it is that almost all of Europe sides with Iran against Israel. He continues, and when almost all European countries side with authoritarian states like Iran, and when journalists and professors at universities cover Israel hate crimes more than any other country around the world, it shows us that anti-Semitism is alive and well. Now Ben-Dror Yemini concludes. He writes, it has been 75 years since the Holocaust, and the enlightened have taken the place of the ignorant. This includes international organizations, heads of states, which support these organizations, academia, the media, as well as Jews and Israelis who are partners in the spread of hate and propaganda. Ben-Dror seems to feel that this is one of the axioms of life today. The Jews and Israel are hated, and there is not much to do about it. Next up is a column from the Jerusalem Post. Again, I'm a weekly columnist for the Jerusalem Post. The op-ed pages in print and online are by far the best single collection of Jewish ideas on the web today. This piece was written by 3 people and was published on May 2nd, 2020. The authors are Eliakim Berman, Donny Zivotofsky, and his brother Ari Zivotofsky. The column is entitled "The Reason Behind Israel's Egg Shortage Over Passover." It shows some real insight. In Israel, on the eve of Passover, there was a serious egg shortage. For many people, eggs are one of the most important staples of their diet on Passover. Millions and millions of eggs were imported to Israel from Australia as well as from European countries. The authors begin the essay simply by stating the obvious. A big story this recent Passover was the egg shortage. From here, the authors explain elements of an argument about the egg shortage and how it was not really a problem. They write, here are the facts. Poultry farms in Israel produce on average 6 million eggs a day, a sufficient quantity for Israeli demand. Every year, demand increases in Tishrei and Nisan, the Hebrew month prior to Passover and the one in which it occurs. There is no way to ramp up production for 2 non-consecutive months. They tried to tell the chickens to work harder and overtime, but they refused. Thus, built into the system is that Israel imports eggs during these 2 months, and this has always worked. Then they ask how there was a shortage, and then they explain that it was very simple. So why was there a shortage, the authors asked, this year? First, due to uncertainties caused by the pandemic, there was hoarding, the same way that people hoarded toilet paper to create a shortage. Second, is there were several 100,000 more people in the country this year than usual. Last year, approximately 750,000 Israelis went abroad for Passover, while 405,000 tourists came to Israel. Assuming that both of those numbers were close to zero this year, there were 345,000 more people in Israel for Passover this year than anticipated. Still, one might ask, the authors say, what if one tried the free market approach, the experiment that has been done? In the open New York of the economically laissez-faire United States, the price of eggs shot up from $1.05 the first week of March 2020 to $3.05 in the first week of April. The American egg industry solved the short-term problem, the short-term egg shortage, not by ramping up production, but by nearly tripling the price. The authors conclude with a simple statement about what really happened. Thus, the egg shortage in Israel was real. However, it was caused by hoarding, a higher seasonal population than normal due to travel restrictions, a greater number of households than normal, each buying eggs, different buying patterns of households, hotels, and other facilities this year, and other variables. One thing is clear. The egg shortage had nothing to do with egg quota system. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show 4 cartoons today. They all come from Powerline blog. The first is a pictoon, a picture with a caption or a dialogue. In a pictoon, sometimes the pictures are cropped and altered, and sometimes they're real. This pictoon pokes fun at COVID-19 and the new reality. It appeared on April 29th. Betty White, the iconic actress, is behind bars in an orange jumpsuit, and their cellmate asks, "What do you in for?" Betty White answers, "I was caught walking in the wrong direction down a grocery aisle." It's hard to imagine just how funny our world has become. I witnessed the looks that people give when others do not follow directions while shopping. This is especially true when you're pushing the grocery cart in the wrong direction down the aisle. Next up, also from Powerline blog, also on April 29th, from 2020, 2 men are on horseback jousting. Their lances are poised and in position, and they're about to hit one another. The caption reads, "Trying to find a hobby that meets the government rules on social distancing." Social distancing rules have certainly been very challenging. The lance is a perfect 6-foot measurement. For your information, jousting is still a sport that's practiced in the United States. It's actually an official equestrian sport. It's actually the official sport of some states. The main difference is that today, the jouster's lance attacks a hanging ring, not a person. Third up is a wonderful play on homeschooling. It's an attempt at teaching fractions. Studies show that drinking has increased tremendously during this crisis. In the picture, there are 4 glasses of wine filled to different levels. The picture reads, today's homeschool lesson, fractions. The wine glasses are filled a quarter, a half, 3/4, and 1 full. Finally, this last pictoon is from Paralink Vlog, but on April 25th. It has 4 images of Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa shows 4 stages of the quarantine. Normal, then masked, taking a selfie with making a peace sign. And the third, she's totally disheveled. Finally, in the 4th, she's totally plumped out. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. ISIS is back and getting stronger and stronger in Iraq. In one of their attacks in Iraq, ISIS attacked an Iraqi Shiite force called Hashad al-Shababi and killed 10 members of the group. Hashad al-Shababi is known as the Popular Mobilization Forces in English. ISIS, or aka ISIL, also known as Daesh, is alive and well. What it's doing is it's growing now throughout Iraq, especially in Anbar, Kirkuk, and Mosul. Hashad published this assessment of the attacks. I'm quoting from their assessment. The Popular Mobilization Forces and security forces have killed and wounded a number of ISIL or Daesh fighters after being exposed to significant attacks on Balad and Makishefa, south of Tikrit. The Hashad also lost 10 members, while several others were wounded in the clashes between the two sides. Egypt also announced that their forces too were in conflict with ISIS now. 50 ISIS members were killed by Egyptian forces. Many more were arrested. This must be a wake-up call for ISIS, for all of us. ISIS is back and striking at their targets in the Middle East. Next up, in a press conference at the State Department, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo implored countries to prevent Iran from flying over their airspace. More specifically, the United States said and was referring to the way that Iran's Mahan Airlines was flying over and delivering support to Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela. What am I talking about? Mike Pompeo here says that there were reports that Venezuela paid Iran 6 tons of gold in exchange for that support. Pompeo said, and I'm quoting here, over the last few days, multiple aircrafts belonging to Mahan Air have transferred unknown support to the Maduro regime. This is the same terrorist airline that Iran used to move weapons and fighters around the Middle East. Pompeo continued saying that the flights must stop. He said that countries should prevent Mahan Air overflights rights, quote, just as many have already denied landing rights to this sanctioned airline, unquote. Iran and Venezuela are uniting to help one another. They are both also strongly committed to hurting the United States and their Western allies. This is just the beginning for them. The entertainment industry has taken a huge hit from coronavirus. From Broadway to Fenway, they're feeling the pinch. 2 Israeli live concert producers have come up with almost the same solution for producing live concerts while adhering to social distancing. The solution is a variation on the theme of the drive-in movie. They are proposing using outdoor space large enough to accommodate 1,000 cars, stages, speakers, performers, and screens. They will restrict patrons to 2 people per car. Food will be available, probably delivered to the cars in their places. The organizers have scouted spots in suburban Tel Aviv, but also in the south of Israel near Beersheba. They are investigating sites near Haifa also. This flashback to an era of drive-in is a very good idea. Live performances with windows down, augmented by individual car speakers or phones with apps that could provide the music perfect into your sound system, is a perfect concert during the era of COVID-19. The stage can be used to screen movies when not being used for a concert. The more things change, the more they stay the same, I suppose. Two brothers from Houston, Matthew and Jeremy Jason, collected kippot, yarmulkes, and then together with the rest of their family, added elastic loops and created face masks for COVID-19 and social distancing. The masks were given to the homeless of Houston. They called the campaign Kippahs to the Rescue. The boys transformed 160 kippot that had been lying around the house. They were kippot from bar mitzvahs and weddings. These kippot all were double-lined, and the double lining makes them a perfect filter for masks. The elastics attached to the sides go around the ears. Matthew, one of the brothers, said, in less than a week, we were able to collect enough of them to make 160 masks. My parents, brothers, and I worked very hard to sew the elastic bands onto them, and they were ready to be delivered by Friday. Good for them. Terrorists attacked Israel's water system recently. The attack came in the form of a cyber attack, and it was focused on the chlorine and pumping departments of the water systems. According to an internal memo between the head of Israel's water department and the head of Israel's cybersecurity, the attack was repelled, and Israel successfully defended itself. No damage was done. The memo ordered everyone to change their passwords, especially those in the chlorine and the pumping control department. If that was not possible, they were instructed to remove themselves and to take their system offline immediately. This attack was sophisticated. It penetrated deep into the system. It leads me to infer that this attack came from one of three sources, either Iran, Russia, or China. Iran, Russia, and China are the three biggest hacking governments in the world. Penetrating Israel's security requires a great deal of computer hacking power. This is not a high schooler having a good time or winning a bet. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. Did you know that Jews have been dealing with epidemics for centuries, and the rabbis have had responses? Some more practical than others. The book of Numbers describes how Aaron and Moses stopped the plague with divine intervention by burning incense. The Zohar takes that idea and describes how Rabbi Acha, a not very well-known rabbi from the Talmud, would gather 40 of the most righteous people into the synagogue. He divided them into 4 groups of 10 each in each of the 4 corners. They studied a section called Pitom HaKetoret, the ceremony of burning incense during the sacrificial rites at the temple. It is said that during the Middle Ages, this act is credited for stopping plagues. Pitom HaKetoret, to this day, is part and parcel of the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.